All right, welcome back to the Narrowband channel. I'm going to talk about a narrowband object tonight, probably one you have never heard of. It's sharp list number 2, or catalog number 2, object number 91. And it doesn't have a name, okay? And it looks a lot like the Veil Nebula. When you look at my images here, you'll say to yourself, wow, it looks like a Veil Nebula number 2. Well, it's not. It's a totally separate object. It's actually kind of nearby. It's in the constellation Cygnus. And boy, is this object ever faint. Okay, I actually, when I went and Google searched for images of this object, I think about 12 objects came up in Google image search. That was it. So it's something that hasn't been imaged very often. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that it is in fact so faint. But it was actually a pretty fun target to image, although I had a lot of frustrations with it. You know, I threw out a ton of data just because, well, 300 second exposures were not long enough to get any detail. So I ended up kind of tossing all that data and I started over again with 600 second exposures. And even with 600 second exposures and a relatively fast f4.5 scope, this target barely shows up. Now, what's so interesting about this thing, and you know, when I kind of processed it, I was kind of like, meh, it's another Veil Nebula, okay? But then when I started doing research about it, that's what really made it interesting to me. So the Veil Nebula is about 7,500 years old. That's supposedly when it would have blown up. But this nebula, or I should say supernova revenant, okay, this is 30,000 years old. So it happened a long time ago. It's also, it's just a lot bigger, okay, because it's had more time to spread out, and that's why it's so faint. It's a lot further away. It's actually a good bit bigger than the Veil Nebula. I didn't find really very much scientific research that's been done about this thing out there. There's a Russian paper done in 2010 on it, and another one that kind of referenced it in 2004, but that's, you know, really about it. So there's lots to learn about this thing, and one of the kind of interesting things in it is that in my images, one of the stars in it, it's a late life supergiant red star, and it is very red in my image. And when I went back and I looked at previous images done by other people using similar equipment to mine, I found that, you know, over the past 10-15 years here, this star has kind of shifted more to the red, which is kind of cool to see that going on. When I processed the data, I was kind of not too impressed, but then once I started to learn something about the target that I was trying to photograph, that's really what kind of made it interesting to me. Now, one last thing here, and I'm going to take you to my equipment. I'll show you the equipment that I used to image this. The entire complex is called G65.3 plus 5.7. Okay, not a very interesting name, but like I said, it is not a very well-known target. To image this target, this is what I use essentially. It's a very simple setup. It is not a very big setup. I am kneeling next to it on the floor. It's an Ioptron 25 GT, or ZEQ, the old one. And then the telescope here, this is a Sharpstar 61mm EDPH, the Mark II version. And yes, I am using the focal reducer and field flattener. And I've been asked before to give details about this setup, so we are going to go into it with a little more detail. I am in fact using the ZWO EAF. This is the USB powered version, and that is what I do my focusing with. I let the software focus for me. I'm using, this is a ZWO ASI Air Plus, and I'm only using 2 power ports in it. One of them powers the dew heater and the other one powers the camera down below. And for my main power right here, this is a 5 amp 12 volt DC power converter here, and I've actually split it. One of them goes into the mount, and then the other one goes up into the ASI Air Plus, which of course then rediverts power to everywhere else. Now for guiding, I'm using, this is a ZWO 290mm guide camera. And I do have a little extender here. This is the ZWO 30mm f4 guide scope. Further down here we have, this is a 5-position filter wheel, and this is kind of where the magic starts. And if you were to try to target this particular target and image it, I would really highly recommend that you have narrowband filters that are under 5 nanometers. And what I'm using in here, these are unmounted narrowband filters. In other words, they don't have any metal rims around them. They're just a 31mm piece of glass. And you need unmounted ones with a scope of this speed, because this is an f4.5, in order to get an image with no vignetting using a 4/3 sensor. Now, the filters that I'm using, they're Botters. They're 3.5 nanometers for the hydrogen alpha, and then they're 4 nanometers for both the sulfur and the oxygen. Now, I only used hydrogen and oxygen to image this target because, well, hydrogen and oxygen is basically all it's there. There isn't really any sulfur in this region. And by the way, this target is so faint that when you start really stretching the hydrogen alpha regions, you got to be kind of careful, because you're going to start running into hydrogen alpha that is within our own galaxy, and it's just going to start showing up in your image. And actually, some of the gradients that appear to be gradients in my image here, they're not gradients, they're actually hydrogen alpha that's in our galaxy. That's my filter wheel. It's a 5-position filter wheel. Those are the only 3 filters that are in there. The other 2 slots are just empty. And then down here, the final camera, this is my ZWO 1600mm Pro. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, I might go after this target with a one-shot killer camera, I don't think that's going to work, even if you have one of the more modern ones. This target is so faint. Even with 600-second exposures, I was barely getting anything. And it took many, many subs to bring out the details that are in my final image. But yeah, it was a challenging target, but I would say once I did the research on what I had actually photographed, that is what kind of made it fun, and also it made me proud of the image that I took. And that's something that I'm kind of making this video because I want people to do some research about what you're imaging. Because knowing something about what you're imaging, or knowing something about what you're looking at in the sky, whether it's through binoculars or telescope or naked eye, that is what makes it more interesting to you, and it will be more than just a pretty picture.